I'm going to introduce you to the members of the panel, and then we'll start with the question period. All the way at the other end is Brendan Greaves, who describes himself as an essayist, curator, folklorist, and sometime musician. He studied at Harvard and the University of North Carolina and currently serves as the North Carolina Director of Public Art and Community Design. He's at work on a book on the Cuban-American collage artist Felipe Jesus Consalvo. And he's also working on a history of occupational folk life, which I don't know the meaning of, but I'm sure he could explain, and an oral history of musicians in Cleveland County, North Carolina. Brendan became interested in James Castle when he was curator and associate director at the Fleisher-Ollman Gallery, of which more later. And he's contributed an essay to the Philadelphia Museum of Art's exhibition catalog, James Castle, a retrospective. John Ullman, sitting to my left, who is a Philadelphia treasure and a former regional fellow of the Penn Humanities Forum, moreover, has been actively involved in the field of 20th century self-taught art since the early 1970s. After 25 years as the director of the Janet Fleisher Gallery, he became sole owner in 1997 and rechristened the space the Fleisher-Ollman Gallery. John advised the Philadelphia Museum of Art on the exhibition Self-Taught Art of the 20th Century in American Anthology some years ago, and as well as on the James Castle exhibition that's currently on. And in his gallery, he's mounted one show after another of the greatest self-taught artists of the last century. Bill Traylor, William Edmondson, Horace Pippin, Martin Ramirez, Joseph Yoakum, Henry Darger, James Jones, Purvis Young, and so on, including James Castle. John's booth at the Outsider Art Fair in New York, when he kept it, he's given up on that, I think, was always the most elegant and refined of all the booths that were there. And Percy received her doctorate in art history at the Courtauld Institute in London and has been curator of drawings at the Philadelphia Museum of Art for the past 36 years. She's written on 17th century Italian artists and on 18th century Roman drawings, but also on the contemporary artist Francesco Clemente, and now on the American self-taught artist James Castle. And says she's not a specialist in outsider art, and so she's going to get the first question, of course. But she says also that she had a wonderful time working on James Castle from the perspective of someone with an old master drawings background. And finally, Jeffrey Wolfe, who is a film director, producer, and writer, and acted in all three capacities for tonight's film, James Castle, Portrait of an Artist. During the 3-year period during which the film was being made, he also edited a number of other films, The Long Shots for the Weinstein Company, First Sunday for Sony, and the independent film Lake City, starring Sissy Spacek, which is opening 2 days from today on November 21st. Jeffrey says he enjoys working in multiple film genres, from the slapstick antics, did I really write? Slapstick antics of Billy Madison to the fun and adventure of the childhood favorite Madeline. James Castle, the James Castle film is Jeffrey's first documentary. He's vice president as well of the board of trustees of the Foundation for Self-Taught American Artists and lives in New York. So this is our distinguished panel, and now I want to begin by asking some questions. And of course, I'll start with Anne, who asked me not to. But in a way, all my questions are meant for everybody on the panel, and we can just begin with Anne. I think that for many people in the audience, it won't be clear why one needs a foundation for outsider art, or why somebody who is as expert in the field of visual art as you would sort of back off and say, well, I'm not an expert in self-taught artists. So maybe if you would just begin to say why it is a special case, this category. That would be a place to begin.
Does this work? Yes. Well, there's those sort of established critical circumstance that you can write on most self-taught artists. It's already set up for you. Somebody like James Castle is not part of a style or a movement or anything that's going to be a chapter in a history of American art. So you kind of have to start out in space somewhere. And working with old master drawings, for me, it was great fun just to look at him as a draftsman and how he has a fabulous ability with his homemade materials, with the linear stickwork and the tonal swiping. He's using these sharpened sticks and pieces of rag and fabric to wipe the tonal areas, and he's fabulous at it. And if you work more and more into his work, as I think Jeff has said, or John has said, or somebody said, the more you go into it, the more there is in front of you to go into. His work has a lot a lot to it, a lot in a large range, and you get into it and you find out that he's not exposed to museums or cities or art books or anything like that, or professional artists in any way, but he adopts all these strategies that appear throughout 20th century art, European and American, surrealism, abstraction, languages, art, collage, using grid or serial imagery, something else I've forgotten, but it's a field where you start out with without a kind of historical or critical baggage to put the person you're writing about in, if that makes any sense.
Does anybody else want to comment on that?
It's an area that you go for that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating and I think a singular example of an artist that we've come in contact with, and at least certainly for me, in the 30 plus years that I've been dealing with art, and particularly with self-taught art. There's so many different ways in which you can look at his work, and every time you think you've sort of made sense of it, something else comes along that changes your idea about it. And we saw that from the very beginning of our introduction to his work, and the way in which the marketplace sort of responded to him. And initially, the critical response to his work was the collage construction work, because it looked so contemporary and so connected to kind of modernist ideas. And nobody was at all interested in the sort of realist, perspective-drawn soot drawings. They just weren't popular. People didn't really. They didn't see them as outsider enough. I mean, they were too good to be sort of self-taught, and so people kind of rejected them. And it took a while. I mean, with the exception of Anne Percy, who got them right away, it took a while for people to kind of understand that that was as much of what James Castle was about as the constructions, and in some ways maybe more important. And at the same time that we were looking at those two elements of Castle's work, we were completely ignoring the text work, which probably is the greatest amount of work that he actually did, and the most sort of, it's like flying without a net when you try to get into that, trying to understand that. And I think that's what Brendan has brought to the table in such a spectacular way, which is really looking at this text work and thinking about what it meant for an artist to spend his entire lifetime working with text as image, and what that meant to Castle, and how we're sort of unable to kind of really permeate the importance of that work.
I just wanted to add one thing too, is that I've, as a collector and admirer of this kind of work, I've been interested in it for 30 years, but it was the first time, and I don't come from a serious art background, so it was very interesting to start the project around the same time that Anne started curating the show, because we ran parallel a lot of the time and intersected a lot of time on the work. And I think that we both sort of came to the same idea of kind of an unfolding, a spiral unfolding. And I think that as what the film tries to do, and what is to explain it a little at a time, so that you can kind of get your bearings with it, and then watch it build through that. And then by the time you get to the end, it's kind of an amazing phenomena that this person kept opening. You know, he would open the door and there'd be 2 doors beyond it, and then you go through those 2 doors and there'd be 3 doors. But there's no way, because of the things Anne was saying, there's no way, when you don't know any of the history of the artist, there's no way to start with the end first. You kind of have to work your way through it. So I thought that was the biggest challenge here. Brendan.
When we're talking about James Castle, and this is amazing, by the way, I didn't think this mic was plugged in, but here's the future before us. When we're talking about James Castle, this phrase, this kind of art, comes up quite a bit, and one needs to do a lot of tiptoeing and do some excavation of the terminology that we're working with, or the lack of terminology. I really think that when these categories come up, these categories, self-taught, outsider, naive, visionary, et cetera, they're really problematic. It's a vocabulary that's broken in some essential way. Our critical mechanism for talking about artists outside the established Western canon is broken in some fundamental way. The categories just kind of break down and dissolve and become quite porous when dealing with James Castle and other artists who don't quite fit our tidy definitions of what the function of art and the role of the artist in society is and can be and should be. When we're talking about modernism in particularly, and all its associated isms, cubism, expressionism, et cetera, minimalism, we're talking about ways to describe a style and a conceptual attack, if you will. But when we use words like outsider and self-taught, et cetera, we're describing the artist and the artist's purported difference or deviance in some social or cultural way. We're not describing the art itself, and that's really problematic. So I think the original question that Wendy asked was about why one would need a foundation or a separate effort to bring critical light to artists who fall by the wayside in terms of normative art histories and historiographies, and these are the reasons, because we need to rebuild our vocabulary kind of from the bottom up.
Well, and that would lead one to, in a way, to ask what that rebuilt set of categories would look like, but I'm not going to pose that at the moment. But it's something we're thinking about. What if we were to find a cache of publications of the Museum of Modern Art hidden away in a corner in James Castle's house, and just, that had never been known before, and to learn that he had indeed been exposed to the history of the official history of 20th century.
Well, I will speak to that.
Oh, good. Go ahead.
When we just opened our show at the gallery called Castle in Context, and where we paired up James Castle with various contemporary artists that we felt resonated with him. And I was talking to his niece, a great niece, about this, Kim, and saying how interesting it was that he had never been exposed to any works of art. And she said, "Oh, that's not true." She said, "Mom had a book on Pablo Picasso that he adored, and that he went through that book and he did basically a version of every painting that was in the book, and then he was done with it and he never looked at it again." So,
But that goes to partially what Brendan was talking about, is that you can't define a self-taught or an outsider by whether they did or didn't take art classes or saw a book or didn't see a book. You can't not look at his work and see the total intent and essence of where he was coming from, and the vocabulary that he formed very early on, his visual vocabulary that he formed very early on. So, I think what John's emphasizing is that just because that book was there, it ultimately doesn't change anything.
I don't think it was any more influential to him than a magazine or the text that he looked at. I mean, because obviously he looked at text, he cut it out of magazines and out of other broadsides, and then he would redraw it in his own fashion. And you look at like, for example, in the show at the PMA, there's one of the words that he draws, it cuts out the word taxes. And then he redraws it, but in a completely different font. So he's like, he's changing and he's adapting. And I think that looking at the Picasso book is no more telling than his looking at the landscape. I think they're equal to him.
Right. I mean, one of the things that really does strike almost a false note in the film is the use of the word naive for him, although I think it's brought up, I think it's Bob Storr who does that, or Rob Storr who does that, but simply because that is yet another synonym for outsider artist. But in a way, he
debunks it at the same time.
Right. No, I'm not. That wasn't a criticism, but he doesn't strike one as visually naive in any way. And one could say that instead of being tutored by the entire history of museum art, that instead he was tutored by graphic art.
Yes, they had a ton of magazines.
And graphic design is no mean teacher, after all.
Advertisements and logos and newspapers and Time and Life and National Geographic, and he uses, carton, container, packaging motifs. I mean, tons of visual stimulation from on the popular
and
literature
fonts
level.
And typography and photographs too. I mean, this is somebody who is also tutored.
So no lack of visual stimulation from the world at large, but just not particularly masses of.
We have a drawing in our show that's we paired up with a city drawing by another artist, and it's a drawing of Trafalgar Square by James Castle. So, I mean, obviously he's looking at many, many sources, and I think more interestingly is that, his acute vision, that I think he really saw things really well. And he examined everything to a kind of level that many artists aren't capable of doing, because they don't have the kind of concentration that I think he had, in part because he wasn't distracted by sound.
Brendan, I said.
Well, with James Castle is evident, I think, in a really palpable way, the various contexts of modernity or plural modernities. The idea that he was living in what today we presume was an isolated frontier territory, and he was born when Idaho was a territory before it was a state. And that's true to a certain extent. There was a great deal of isolation compared to what we are all used to here in this room. But these assumptions, I think, are entirely inadequate to explain the way that modernity functions in 20th century America and the roots to and through modernity via the dissemination of printed matter throughout the nation, and obviously working, the fact that his parents did run the local postal office was a profound influence on him, that he was exposed to this media and able to digest it in some basic way and reconfigure it to make it personal and new. And in that sense, his method of working was intimately related to that of other modernists, the fact that he was functioning through through dealing with appropriation and collage tactics. So the context is not as different as we might assume, and there are limits to thinking about it contextually, I think.
Okay, one more question before I open it up to the audience. But we're celebrating here not just James Castle, but a film about James Castle, and I want to congratulate Jeffrey and Jill Bonowitz for making such a wonderful film. I want to ask you about the choices that you made in terms of visual content here. So, for example, the wonderful location shots, which, given that this is a moving picture, were rather strikingly unmoving unless there was a person standing in them talking. They were very still photographs that we were given, as opposed to the talking head shots, which were full of animation. And that's just one sort of thing I noticed about that. Could you talk more about?
Yeah, that was obviously a conscious choice. If you spend, I'm a city kid, and when you stand out there in the fields of Idaho, you know, nothing changes for hours and hours and hours.
Cows moving.
I mean, seriously, I started to get the feeling that Castle's work was like a photograph, only that there were many of them, and you could kind of just stand there and imagine it almost in the field. And so you talk about the waving. That was about the most movement, but that was important. And I even gave it a little bit of a sound so that people would recognize that that's what was happening. But literally, the days are 14 to 16 hours long, and the sun will hardly move in the sky. And I think for the kind of drawing that he did in that when he was up in Garden Valley, it's clear that it's very representational of that. And I also think, the movie's supposed to be a bit of a meditation on what his experience was and what it's like to kind of go through that. It's very hard when somebody is no longer with you and there was no moving footage of him or audio tape of him to try to get inside to express his life, not make it a bunch of people talking about him, but somehow to try to express what his life was like. I mean, what Brendan said is true. You can't do that completely injustice. You can't give it complete justice, but we can try.
Okay. So now we're ready to take questions, and if you could just make sure that you project, because everybody has to hear what you have to say. Arthur.
I want to ask you, first of all, I want to congratulate you on the movement. But my question is, suppose there was no James Castle. He didn't exist, and somebody brought you a box of this art. I'm wondering, would you be as enthusiastic about it, not knowing anything about the artist?
Well, when I first saw James Castle's work, I didn't know anything about the artist 11 years ago. And, I saw it being unpacked from boxes at the time that I saw it. And there was something that that immediately resonated for me with his work. So I think if somebody came into the gallery, I would probably have the same response. We happen to be, the beneficiaries of the fact that his family was so committed to him that they saved all of that work. I mean, it's an extraordinary experience. It doesn't happen very often.
And I think that's a leading question in the sense that, in the foundation, we're looking at a lot of artists. There's probably 50 artists that we decided were worthy of, at least putting up on the website. But we've broken down quite a bit to 10, actually, of the people who we most want to make films about. And that has nothing to do with the narrative. It has to do with how we feel about the work. And so we didn't make this film about Castle because he had a great backstory. We made the film about Castle because we loved the content. The story unfolded, which is always a good thing, but it was really about the art.
The question's an important one, I think, because there is a sense that in some essential way biography is abused when we're talking about artists who seem to be different. than what we study in art history textbooks. And James Castle is one of those artists. And his biography, unusual as it is, certainly has been used as a justification for why the work is important. And that is a liability, I think, of work that doesn't have a strong or established critical apparatus to interpret it, that we fall back on biographical specificity in a way that I think lames the actual aesthetic unpacking of the art or the affective unpacking of the art. And by that I mean the way that we actually deal with it as people in the world when we look at it, how we respond to it on an emotional level or on a psychological level or on a political or social level. So I think your question is a good one, and I don't have a good answer.
Sheldon.
As a collector of Castle, it's irrelevant to me as well. It's an interesting story, but it's really irrelevant in terms of buying the art, thinking about the art. I think I'm expressing the view of most collectors. They don't say, geez, the dumb artists we really have. You just use the standard. You look for any art, any contemporary art that you like.
I have two questions, actually. The first question is, I noticed that James Castle's picture, we wondered, did he have some sort of autism or some kind of developmental disability? We've been trying to figure that out. I've looked it on the internet, and I just wondered about that. That's one question. My second question is, I don't know if any of you have heard this art movement called Devia, which deals with deaf visual art. And there's an art professor gave a presentation at the Art Museum last month and talked about she didn't feel that he had autism, but that he definitely, his work really meets the criteria of the deaf art movement in terms of how he showed hands and how he showed himself. But he never met any other, really worked with other deaf people. The professor said that he was born 30 years too early to be involved in that deaf art movement, though. That was her contention.
There's no medical records at all, and the theory of autism has been put out there, but...
It's okay. It makes a lot of noise on the microphone.
It does. I'm an art historian, not a medical person, and I just don't want to go there. Too slippery a slope. I can't make any suggestions. I don't know anything about autism, and I think it's something we'll never know. But is it inappropriate, Wendy, for me to put a question in your mouth to ask another panelist?
Of course.
It is not inappropriate.
Go ahead.
The thing that's really tough, and it's what Brendan tackled in his essay, is how do you deal with somebody who, like Ed Ruscha or Lawrence Weiner or a zillion other artists, especially in the third quarter of the 20th century, and after, who use text, language as art, and do text art. How do you deal with a person who we do think from the recorded recollections truly never heard language spoken? He didn't know the sound of language, and who probably got a pretty good grasp of books and words and stuff in his 5 years at the deaf school, but we will never know what he got because he didn't leave any spoken or written record, and he didn't talk to other people. So how in the hell do you deal with this person as a text artist? And Brendan could perhaps briefly sum up how he did that, because it was a toughie.
Wow. Okay.
Not dodging the bullet.
Briefly, first of all, in terms of speculation as to Castle's mental state or, alleged autism, I would agree with Anne that that's just speculation, and it's not going to necessarily get us anywhere useful, I don't think. On a more fundamental level, I'm more interested in considering Castle's sameness rather than his difference. I think that there are already enough extant barriers between the way his work has been discussed and the way the work of other artists has been discussed, and I'm more interested in an explication of his work as something that is, in some elemental way, the same as the work of other artists. And that was an interest of mine in dealing with his text pieces, which are really difficult to unravel. They're very difficult to wrap one's head around. But I thought of them, in a sense, as the work of a grammatogenist, which is a big word that means the inventor of a writing system. And what I think is clear from the work, after you spend some time looking at it, is that Castle really understood the idea of language. We don't have any way to definitively ascertain whether he understood the operations of language as it's used in standard English speech or writing. Obviously, there are the grammatical valences that he was exploring, and the spelling choices were, don't align in any way with the way we use English. But I think he was absolutely interested in deconstructing the English language, and even others. He understood what writing was, and that it had some elemental power that was related both to line and mark making and to communication. And in that sense, he shares quite a bit, I think, with other modernist artists engaged in visual poetry, Dadaists and Surrealists, who were interested in the same kind of deconstruction. What they were taking apart, he was trying to put together, I think. And I like thinking about him in the same sphere as other artists with whom he isn't often grouped. Although in the Fleisher-Ollman show, he is. So there are certainly efforts to make that happen.
I think it's an extremely interesting thing to think about, because it looks so contradictory in his work. Very often he uses letters of the alphabet in a purely formal fashion. It appears as if they have nothing to do with language, and he'll sort of pull them and play with them, and he'll reproduce words on signs or ads or something like that, and he'll reverse the letter for no particular reason. It seems as if he liked the form to go that way better. So it's a kind of arbitrariness. But then in that example of place, remember that was discussed. Actually, the lettering after the P, which spells out lace, has a laciness to it. It's lattice. And so you think, is he punning? I mean, is he really, and it's a visual pun as well as a verbal one. So, I mean, that would take a considerable verbal acuity to do. So he's so mysterious that way and contradictory.
I mean, there's just one other thing. Those little characters that he puts in the corners, too. Jackie Chris, who's been around the work a lot, also says that those people are telling his story for him. And that,
he's got speakers.
He has beside the words, he also has speakers in there telling it. So I'm with Brendan on that. In the sense of, I don't think I'll ever kind of come to grips with the language part of this. And I've been struggling with it for a long time myself.
I think the quote from Mr. Weiser, what's his name?
Claire.
Yeah, when he says that that he felt finally that he was left out of James Castle's world, and I think that the more that I've looked at it and the more I look at the text drawings, the more I'm convinced that they make sense, and that I don't understand the language that he's using, and even the words. I mean, even the drawings that seem to be sort of disconnected. The more you look at them, the more sort of logic they have to them, and the more sort of animated they become. There's a kind of an animist quality to them, where he starts giving them kind of, like a spiritual quality, where the letters start changing and become figures or become trees or houses. And I mean, I think it's the most fascinating. At this point, I think it's the most fascinating thing he's done.
Let me just tell a quick story about Claire Weiser, though. That when I did a pre-interview with him, he quoted from The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, where he said he felt sorry for James Castle because he was locked in and couldn't get anything out. And when I interviewed him on camera, he didn't tell that story. I kept leading him to that story, and I couldn't get him to repeat it. And so after the interview, I went over to him and I said, I asked him why he wouldn't go there, and he said that actually that after he got off the phone with me, he went back. He's a mathematician. He's a very thoughtful guy. He went back to his chair and he realized that it wasn't Castle that was locked in. It was him who was missing that opportunity. So, like when you really get thoughtful with this guy, there's really a lot to learn from him. So, very smart man, Castle. I mean.
Yes.
I think that's one of the things that over the last 11 years is that you never get to a point where you think you understand the work. Mm-hmm. There's always something else that changes the way you think about it. I mean, and I look at it every day, and I still feel that way.
Other questions? Okay.
Well, I mean, he actually was exhibited fairly extensively during his lifetime, starting in the late 40s, when the family became aware of what Uncle Jim was making was actually something that people would look at. Then, in fact, he did start having exhibitions, and he had a one-person show at the Boise Art Museum. He was shown west of the Rockies primarily. So there was exposure. It was at a time when people weren't paying that much attention to self-taught art, and particularly people like James Castle. Some of the notoriety that he got was, kind of not what you would consider to be extremely positive. I mean, it was sort of, a freak of nature makes art, that kind of thing. In terms of him benefiting from it, I think he did. By making it financially, the family didn't benefit from it at the time that he was making it because nobody really benefited from self-taught art at that time. It wasn't that marketable. The benefit was the support that he got from his family and the fact that they saved all of it, and it is his legacy, and we know him now as a great artist. And so we benefited from it. And and the family was very smart. They put together a family trust that manages the whole estate. And I wouldn't say that they're going to retire in great wealth from that, but they are certainly better off than they were. Although Jerry Garrow, who really managed the estate until she died last year, was a very savvy business person, and James Castle was just one part of her savviness. She was quite a shrewd real estate person.
I can speak to the spit. Paper Conservators did a lot of technical analysis, and they're chemists as well at the PMA, on the objects themselves. And I don't know whether James Castle figured this out himself or what, but the spit's thicker than water, and it gets that sooty, that granular soot better adhered to the papers, which he frequently roughed up the fibers of the papers before he did mostly color work. And he also used water. It's not all spit, but it does have a kind of quality that makes the medium adhere to the paper better.
I think there's also
quite moving metaphorical correspondence related to the use of saliva, the fact that he didn't speak, and yet he was using this medium from his mouth without which we can't speak. And he obviously knew that speech came from human mouths, but that's just kind of a poetic way of thinking about it. It's not really meaningful.
Well, and Terry Winters would talk about, if you go into the art supply store, there's 100 kinds of blacks, probably 1,000 kind of blacks that you could choose from. But this combination of what he ended up with, it did for him what he needed. And, if he rejected other things after that, it was because they didn't answer his needs.
Well, it seems we're almost out of time, but maybe I can be persistent and re-ask my initial question, because I don't think we really did much with it, and that is, what changes in the world of art history by introducing figures like James Castle into it? Is this just no problem whatsoever? Once you do it, it's there and it's just fine, or does something profound happen in terms of our posing the very idea of what is art, or what do we teach to students, to put it in an educational setting, or what is it that we say about art and about what makes it good?
I think there's been a really interesting change, and I think Castle is kind of a good way of looking at that, because when he was first exhibited, there was no serious art historical attempts to understand his work or talk about it. And, there has been a profound change from 1960 to the present. And I think James Castle came back into the art world at a time where the work could really be considered in a really serious way, in which it had never really been dealt with before. I mean, it's an amazing journey from 1960 to a retrospective at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I mean, for those of us who've been involved in this for the last 35 years, and we would not have expected that to have happened. I mean, it's a very, very big difference in what's happened. And so Castle is now out there and being discussed, and this is the time that could happen, I think, in the best possible light.
I also think that we're not trying to get rid of the words outsider and self-taught as much as we are trying as much as we're trying to blur the lines between insider and outsider ideas. I mean, where people come from isn't. John's coming from a different place with that, but where they come from isn't what's important. Again, it goes back to that original question. It's the quality of the work, and that work should be looked at as closely as work that's done, in a school. And one of the things that made me most interested about this is that there's a certain purity in it that I hope art students get to look at and kind of evaluate, and maybe kind of switch around some of the ways that they think about some of the things that they go about doing, and because it freshens things up a bit. And I think the art world was getting a little stale, and that might be part of the reason art's being a little more accepted now. So,
we also live in a much more pluralistic kind of environment. I mean, we're looking at art that's we're no longer just Western focused. I mean, you can't be and be sort of involved in the contemporary art world. I mean, there's exciting work that's coming out of Africa and India and China, and that wasn't the case 10 years ago. I mean, it wasn't part of the discussion of contemporary art 10 years ago. So Castle and, self-taught artists, I think, are just another part of that whole opening up to
the canon of that.
All the different types of art experiences.
Mm-hmm. I really can't answer that question, but I bet Brendan can take a crack at it. I simply can't answer the question, but it kind of reminds me of there was this very interesting moment in, I guess, the 20s, 30s, 40s, when people who were deeply involved with the with modern art at that time, like Abby Aldrich Rockefeller and Electra Havermeyer Webb and Edith Halpert and Edeline Nadelman, were seriously looking at folk art. And so a lot of, and collecting folk art and contemporary art. Abby Aldrich Rockefeller was one of the 3 co-founders of the Museum of Modern Art, and left this incredible folk art collection. Folk art is not the same as outsider, but that's what pops into my mind, but I cannot answer that question.
Okay.
I don't know if I can answer the question either.
Maybe that was a miracle. It's not.
Yeah, I think it died. Technology it doesn't work. I think that there is, as Jeffrey mentioned, perhaps a slight blurring that's occurring, and that is something I'm hopeful about. That we might be able to dissolve some of these binaries, these polarities that we live with in our culture today. Things like folk versus fine, vernacular versus academic, elite versus lower. These ideas of opposition, I think, they're cultural constructs, and they're in a way crippling to moving forward and thinking about creativity and expressive culture in meaningful and open ways. So I think this moment, this show, this film are helpful in that process of dissolving those sets of categories. There's a folklorist named Henry Glassy whose work I like quite a bit, and he talks about keeping the idea of art wide and useful, and I think that's kind of a profound and poetic way to think about the making of things by people, that we need to keep these ideas wide and useful.
Well, I think that's a wonderful place to end, and partly because Henry Glassy used to teach at Penn, and we're very proud of that. But more generally, I keep on being struck by the input of Philadelphia into the whole discussion of outsider art or self-taught art, and thinking about it as a kind of an expression of perhaps of a city that is neither Washington nor New York nor Los Angeles. I mean, that exists in some other modality, perhaps, and maybe that has some relevance to this, too. I don't know. But in any case, I want to thank you all for coming tonight, and to thank the members of the panel for their contribution.